Thank you all for joining B'nai B'rith during our annual observance of the United Nations International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. We dedicated this year's program to the need to hear directly from Holocaust survivors themselves about their experiences during the Shoah. First, we'll receive the personal testimony of Professor Ivan Lefkovits. Ivan Lefkovits was born in Prešov in today's Slovakia in 1937. His father was later murdered in Budapest, Hungary, where his family tried to flee growing anti-Jewish persecution. In 1944, he was taken along with his mother and his older brother to the Ravensbrück Nazi concentration camp, where his brother was also murdered at the age of 15. With his mother, Ivan Lefkovits survived the final months at the notorious Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. After returning to Prešov following the war, his mother remarried and left for Prague with her son in 1949. There, Ivan Lefkovits graduated from the University of Chemical Technology. He subsequently worked at the International Laboratory of Genetics and Biophysics in Milan, and in 1967, after a short stay in Czechoslovakia, he moved to Nuremberg, where he began his career as an immunologist at the Paul Ehrlich Institute. In 1969, Lefkovits was a founding member of the Basel Institute for Immunology, where he worked for many years and was also a researcher in the laboratories at the University Hospital of Basel. He's been a professor at Philipps University in Marburg, Germany, and lectured at the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology in Oxford, Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and at the Trudeau Institute in Saranac Lake, New York. He's also a former chairman of the Central European Summer School of Immunology. Lefkovits is the recipient of numerous awards and a member of the Learned Society of the Czech Republic. In addition to scholarly works, he's also published a collection of 15 memoirs of Holocaust survivors with covers designed by the renowned artist Gerhard Richter, which he presented to, among others, Switzerland's first female and first Jewish president, Ruth Dreyfus. He's married to Hannah, has a son, Michael, who is a medical doctor. In 2007, he received an honorary doctorate from the University of Prešov. We'd like to express our thanks to B'nai B'rith Geneva representative Anita Winter and the Gemaral Foundation, of which she serves as president, and which does important work supporting Holocaust survivors in Switzerland, for connecting us with Professor Lefkovits. I'm now honored to turn over the mic to Professor Ivan Lefkovits as we listen to his testimony about his family's horrific experience during the Holocaust.
My name is Ivan Lefkovits. I'm a Swiss citizen of Czechoslovak origin, and I'm a retired scientist. And I would like to use the rare occasion of talking to you and to tell our story. But normally, when I do so, I directly start with the decisive moment of the arrest by the Gestapo. Here, I do not know who are the people listening to my words. Therefore, I will spend a minute or two telling the historical setup of the time. There was a country called Czechoslovakia. It emerged from the disrupted and destroyed Austrian-Hungarian monarchy during the World War I. A new modern country was created with a charismatic President Masaryk as a democratic leader of the country in 1918. Everything looked well and promising. And in fact, everything went very well until certain unpleasant things appeared. So until the neighboring country, Germany, gave the opportunity to rise to power a man who destroyed most of the world later, and that was Adolf Hitler. As Hitler came to power, Germany issued immediately anti-Jewish laws called Nuremberg laws. And these laws allowed persecution of Jews. But this was only on their territory, in Germany. But in March 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, and one of the first things which he did was that he installed, or he pushed to be installed, the mentioned Nuremberg law, and it was the first time the German law was applied in another territory. That is something what a listener or the audience need to know to understand the next set of events which I'm going to describe. Here, I can begin with that what I consider our own family return, and it is about part of the Czechoslovakia which is called Slovakia. It's in the eastern end of Czechoslovakia. The western part is called Czech lands, and in Slovakia existed a relatively large Jewish community. The Jewish community was something what didn't fit the Nazis, and they were determined to destroy the entire Jewish population. Thus, Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia gave not only a pretext, but gave a possibility for starting deportations to the concentration camp, and that started immediately. Before protest of the free world started, 60,000 people were deported from Slovakia. It happened that our family at the beginning was spared of this fate for one simple reason, that there was another law which required that people who were of economical importance to the country, that they should not be deported. My parents were, my father was medical doctor, my mother was a pharmacist. So at the beginning, they were not deported. They were persecuted in them that they had to wear the David Star, but otherwise, and children, including me and my elderly brother, were not allowed to go to schools. But our family realized that this is only a temporary measure, that we are not persecuted, so that we are not deported. So my parents tried to arrange to escape, but we had not enough information about that, where to go, where is a safe place to go. And if all this information was not available, then the next best thing which we could do was to go at least to the neighboring country, in this case to Hungary. This meant that our family had to be at certain time point disrupted. That is, my father went to Hungary, I came as a second one, and then the border was closed. I was sent back to my parents to Slovakia. My father was trapped in Hungary, and this was the greatest mistake, as I see it now, even half a century later. This was bad, that we were split, that part of the family was in one country and another in another one. So one day, when Gestapo and the so-called Hlinka Guard, which is the Nazis of Slovakia, when they at 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes in the end of October, beginning of November 1944, came and found us, then we were arrested and we realized that our family is never going to be the same. So we were taken to the concentration camp Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was a women's camp. It's located some 70 kilometers north of Berlin. And this transport from Slovakia to Ravensbrück took several days. And it was for us a totally unexpected situation that we had to be in a cattle car for several days. And upon arrival, my elderly brother was separated from us, and I was allowed to stay with my mother. I was at the time 7 years old, and my brother was moved to the men's camp. The men's camp was bad, was worse than the camp for women, and unfortunately, we have never seen him again. Only decades later, we found out how he was murdered. The staying in Ravensbrück was bad, but functional. We had to get up and stay for the so-called roll call, as the English word uses it. And from 4 o'clock to 6:30 was the roll call. We were counted, and then the women had to work while the children were staying in the barracks. Some children had some primitive toys. I remember having nothing. Calories which we received were definitely below the sustainability, and we started to lose weight, all of us, and we started to lose power, strength, but still we had at least a piece of bread and maybe a soup or coffee in the evening. After New Year, 1945, rumors were spreading that the camp will be evacuated. Why would it be? It is because from the Eastern Front, the Russians were approaching. So the Germans wanted to have these inmates in a place where they could decide upon their fate. So there were several transports, often very chaotic ones, but they moved us to a place which we didn't know ahead of time what it is. It turned out to be Bergen-Belsen, which is northwest from Berlin, some 300 kilometers away. The journey took several days, but it was much worse than the journey from Slovakia to Ravensbrück. Here, it was under conditions that we were already emaciated, we were very thin, we didn't have enough calories, and a lot of people during this transfer died. This was well an intention also of the oppressors, because any Jews who did not arrive to the new place was for them a welcome place. We had part of the journey by train, by cars, but a certain portion was by foot. Later, this was known as the Death March. As I mentioned, the new place was some 300 kilometers northwest from Berlin. And those who arrived to Bergen-Belsen realized that the horror of Bergen-Belsen is incomparable with anything else. Later, we found out what was going on in Auschwitz, what was going in many other camps, but Auschwitz was bad because of the enormous number of people who were killed, but least to say is that at least they were killed fast. In Bergen-Belsen, these people were starving to death, and these people totally exhausted who were continuing losing weight. And we arrived and we were pushed into barracks which were already full. We were accepted grudgingly by the inmates there. They didn't want to have new people. They were quite bad to us. But a few days later, when another people arrived, and we already settled in that barracks where we had difficulty a few days earlier, now we were unpleasant to the newcomers. And finally, it happens that when the number of people doubled, the number of people quadrupled, so we received half of the portion and 1/4 of a portion, and we didn't have enough to have at least a little bit. And what came the worst was that the solidarity among the inmates vanished. These people lost their inner inhibition, or not all, but some of them lost, and it became a dangerous place. It was dangerous to go out. It was dangerous to go to the toilet, to the latrine. Everything was dangerous because people started to behave like animals, and there was also some cannibalism going on. In the commanders of the camp, they tried at least to move away the dead corpse. So there were groups of people who were put to do this work, with the result that these people themselves were so exhausted that while they were pulling the corpses and the dead bodies, they died. They died during their work, which shows that it was a total end. And then came a moment, April 4th, 1945, that the Germans decided to leave the camp, not to give up the camp, but just to lock it up, blew up the water, stop the electricity, and go away. For 11 days, we had nothing to eat, nothing to drink. It seems very improbable what I am saying, that we 11 days didn't have water, because the physiology tells us that we cannot survive longer than 4 days without water. But we survived 11 days. And those who drank any water from any sources, they died, in this case, not because of having lack of water, but there was infection and they died after that. On 11 days later, the British Army entered the camp and we were free. Being free was a great thing for half an hour, until we found out that these people who arrived there, they simply didn't know what to do seeing these terrible conditions, and they would be able to distribute food immediately, but that was not needed. Water was needed, and that was not available. And I cannot go here to details, but 48 hours later arrived big, huge cistern cars, such which are used now for transport of oil or gas or whatever. And they unrolled the sleeves which distributed then the water, and suddenly we had enough of that. But during this time, thousands of people still died. At the time of liberation, there were 16,000 not buried people. And the British ordered to prepare places for mass graves. And the infection, typhoid infection, did spread so fast that there was danger that everybody will die. So finally, they had a bulldozer who was pushing these dead corpses into the mass grave. And there are several mass graves which we visit now, decades later, and they are very beautifully maintained. And some of them have 5,000 dead bodies, some have 1,000. There is even one which has only 500. And this is how what was the end of Bergen-Belsen. The old camp had to be destroyed and was burned down. Before that, we were moved to a clean lazaret where we could recover. The dying continued every day from something like 23rd of April when we were in clean conditions, and there was going on in entire months of May, and it was probably on 5th of June was the first day when on the lazaret appeared an inscription, "Today nobody died." And that was for us something which we realized that the new life started. I was in a very bad situation at the liberation. There do exist in Imperial War Museum photos of me made by the British health people, where I, as an 8-year-old boy, did weigh 9 kilograms. When I have seen our grandchild, when as a baby, he was 9 kilograms, I remembered how I was when I was 8 kilograms. The body was actually gone. The only thing which remained was the head and the brain. And the brain was supplied with enough blood so that we more or less survived, or some of us survived. I recovered very fast. My mother less. For my mother, it took longer time. And finally, we went to the medical people and said we would like to go home. And late in July 45, there was a comfortable, wonderful transportation which brought us back to Slovakia. The journey through destroyed Germany was absolutely great. It was so bad that it was great. We have seen that Germany is destroyed, and we were so pleased. It's not very noble to say so, but it was our revenge. Goebbels asked, "Do you want a total war?" And millions of Germans shouted, "Yes, we want a total war." So then we were riding back and we realized they did have the total war. And we arrived back to Slovakia, and we arrived home, and it was a kind of inner victory, but not really, because our dear ones were not there. So from side of Lefkovits family, nobody survived. From the side of my mother, there were 4 girls, 4 sisters, all 4 survived. Statistically very improbable, this situation, but they survived. And the man or anybody on the Lefkovits side was dead. My brother was dead, my father was dead, my uncles, everybody was dead. I said it was end of July 1945. Then was 1 month more, August, and then 1st of September started the new school year. And I did not have previously any schooling because the Jews were not allowed to go to school. My mother taught me to read and write and count, calculate, and I was accepted directly to the 3rd class. So I, so to say, didn't lose anything in education. We stayed there until 1949, and then we moved to Prague. Prague is a different story. Maybe at one occasion I will tell you, because Slovakia was a place which allowed me to survive, but the Czech people and the Czech part of Czechoslovakia allowed me to thrive. I received a good education. I hated the communist system. I was told by my mother and my stepfather, my mother in meantime married again, that it's good to get out of the country as soon as possible. I received my education, and then I went to various places. I lived in Italy, in Germany, and from 1969 until my retirement, I was in Basel, in a place which is called the Basel Institute for Immunology, which gave me a wonderful opportunity to do good science and to enjoy new life. Still in Prague, I married. My wife's name is Hanna. We had a son, Michael, and then Switzerland became our second home. Now we, from time to time, travel back to Prague to see the beautiful cultural city of Prague, but we feel at home here. And we only hope that things which happened then, Holocaust, that it will never happen again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lefkovits, for sharing your story with us. We know that for many, discussing the horrors that they endured during the war is very difficult, as it brings back the trauma of that period. But this testimony is so powerful in refuting the lies of those who seek to deny or distort the reality of the Holocaust. And this history must be heard and shared. An additional part of Professor Lefkovits' testimony will be posted on our B'nai B'rith YouTube channel shortly after our program concludes, for those who'd like to hear a bit more about his remarkable life and career in the wake of his wartime experience. In our next segment, we explore the future of Holocaust remembrance. We're approaching a reality that many of us dread but know will inevitably come, the day when there will be no more living Holocaust survivors. In the next part of our program, we'll explore how one museum is making sure that the experience of the Holocaust survivors can live on forever through interaction with future generations. I'm pleased now to introduce Ms. Kelly Zaney, Senior Vice President of Education and Exhibitions at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, to talk about the museum's innovative approach to Holocaust education and remembrance through the use of innovative technologies. Kelly Zaney, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Well, first, can you explain to our audience what virtual reality, which we will refer to later as VR, is, and how the museum uses it in your A Journey Back exhibit? And can you speak a bit about the movies featuring Fritzi and George?
Sure. So virtual reality technology is a way to be able to immerse the viewer in a full 360-degree experience. So currently at the museum, as you mentioned, our Journey Back experience is provided through HTC Vive headsets that you're putting over your face and covering your ears with the headsets. So you're really getting a full visual and audio experience in which you are able to immerse yourself in our two films, the experiences of walking on the grounds of Auschwitz, Mauthausen, and Ebensee with two of our survivors, Fritzi and George. But it's really meant to almost kind of transport or bring the visitor away from the current experience that they're in into a completely different world and journey as a way to fully connect with the history of the Holocaust. A Journey Back, a VR experience, as you mentioned, has two films, A Promise Kept, which features Fritzi Fritschall, former president of our museum and survivor of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and George Brent, survivor of Birkenau, Mauthausen, and Ebensee. And our visitors through these 14-minute films have the opportunity to go to not only the childhood homes of both Fritzi and George and learn about what their life was like before the occupation of their respective countries by the Nazis, but then their deportation, subsequent arrival of both of them at Birkenau, and then following them through liberation and their lives today. Both films really ultimately leaving on that important message for our visitors of the importance to never forget, to remember, and the importance of being witnesses to their stories and sharing their stories.
You know, all of us try to keep up with the latest technology, to have the latest phone, to have the latest iPad or tablet. But when did the museum make the decision to preserve Holocaust memories using VR, which is a technology that has only become mainstream just in the last few years? And what is the museum's goal in producing these movies?
Yeah, two great questions. So the idea of using virtual reality really came after the completion and opening of our Survivor Stories Theater, which was the partnership we had developed with USC Shoah Foundation in 2015 and the development of Dimensions in Testimony, the holographic technology, and where you can use interactive voice recognition technology to have a conversation, ask questions with survivors. And that was very successful for us in many ways. But a lot of our survivors, particularly Fritzi, began to say, okay, I've told my story. I know that generations to come are going to be able to engage with that. But what about the sites where these atrocities took place? What about them? Are they going to be left to ruin? What about, again, the survivors like herself who can testify to what happened there? So she said, I want another project. We need to think of something else. So we began to really talk about leaders with leaders in the museum exhibition design field, some of the folks that we had worked with on the holographic technology, and landed on this idea of VR. But we knew that we still wanted the story to be the forefront of what we did. We, over trying to figure out exactly what we wanted to do, knew that we wanted a kind of documentary style film. There is a lot of VR and AR, augmented reality, that's out there that's animation produced. It doesn't, it kind of recreates sites or historical institutions or museums. We knew we didn't want that. We really wanted to make sure we were on the ground with the camera, again, with kind of that documentary style, and to bring our survivors to those places. And ultimately, in producing the films, we then in post-production ran head on into COVID. So ultimately, it took about 3 years in post-production and to ultimately open the on-site experience here at the museum.
Now, there are many survivors who have testified on video, and there are many Holocaust-related movies screened in 2D. You've talked about it a little bit, but let's perhaps dig a little bit deeper. What makes the VR format such a richer, more immersive experience?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's the immersive. The value of the two-dimensional testimony is important, right? And the fact that we have that in sometimes those 3, 4, some survivors 6-hour testimonies is important. So we really have the full breadth and scope of their experiences. What sets VR apart is, as you mentioned, that immersive feeling of being able in a 360 environment where you're in a way kind of isolated, right? This is an experience onto yourself. You know, you're in the room. In our on-site experience, we have 8-seated experience, but you know you're with other people, but you're just listening to Fritzi or George, and you're moving around in a way that, for instance, some of the films that you mentioned, right? We're seeing Fritzi or Anna Lakahana on the arrival ramp at Birkenau talking, but it's 2-dimensional. So imagine now feeling as if you're standing right there on the arrival ramp with Fritzi as she tells you what it's like. And while she's talking, you're able to spin your chair and look around and really get the full scope of what it's like to be there today and to experience. And I think that that's what really makes it different. On top of course, you have the audio and the music and the whatnot, but it's a different level, I think, of immersion and emotion that 360 environment really gives you in a way that the 2-dimensional testimony is very valuable, but don't bring you to that edge of emotion.
The Journey Back has been active for a year now. It actually opened last International Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27th of 2022. What feedback have you gotten from younger generations or from schools who have sent groups to visit on school trips on the effectiveness of deploying technology in this innovative way to keep the history of the Holocaust alive? I mean, this new technology seems made for the current generation, which is accustomed to new technology and technological change on a regular basis.
Yeah, again, Dan, you're so spot on because, when the young people come on site we don't have to do any onboarding about how to put the headset on or how to they're immediately putting it on and they're ready to go. But the impact really across visitorship, but again, particularly with the young people, has been really profound. We've had everything from folks who have been to Auschwitz, but have said, to be able to be guided by Fritzi or George brought a deeper level of understanding of the impact of their story. That the young people are sharing that, particularly the kind of documentary feel of the film, and to be able to really sense Fritzi's emotion as if you're kind of, again, standing there with her, has provided them a deeper level of empathy and perhaps understanding of the history and, again, the scope of the atrocities that took place at Auschwitz. Because in the virtual reality film, you're not only having Fritzi provide testimony, but we're doing different camera work. So we're using drones that are flying above the gates of Birkenau and looking at the women and men's side of the camp. And you're beginning to see just how massive Birkenau was. So and we've heard from a lot of people, oh my God, I had no idea, right, that it was so big. Or being able to create what we've called these memory spaces, where we're using illustration to talk to people about, when Fritzi talks about being in the slave labor factory of 599 women, you're standing in the space surrounded by 599 women. What that must, feel like, not in a way to take you back there or to recreate, because we can never do that. But for you to really get, again, that emotional and even cognitive sense of what's happening. And the young people are really connecting to the history, but in particular the story. They just keep, I've even had young people say, you can be very active and spinning around and looking around, and they're just very passive and they sit in the chair. And then when I say to them afterwards, you didn't move around, they said, I know I didn't want to turn my back on Fritzi. I felt it was rude to turn my back. I wanted to keep listening to her. But again, it just shows you that, you want in some ways the awe of the technology to fade away and the story to remain. And that we've just consistently have seen from our visitorship, the profound impact that story has.
Do survivors tell you when they go through this? Do survivors say, yes, I've tried to tell my story, but this goes even beyond my ability to gather everything in? Are you getting that kind of feedback from survivors?
Yeah. Oh, yes. So what was really fantastic in the early experience with Fritzi and George, in particular George, is George had never been back to his hometown since the end of the war. So he put on these goggles. That was the first time he had seen his hometown since he was deported in 1944. And as someone who was watching him in the room, he was spinning around and going, "Oh, that's where the church used to be. And I wonder if the ice cream shop I used to go to when I was a kid was still there." So to be able to see the joy of them seeing their pre-war homes was something interesting. Um, Secondary to that, we've had the children of the survivors say to us. So George's daughter at the opening last January said to us, I've spent obviously 60 something years of listening to my father tell this story, and it wasn't until I watched his film that I fully got it, that I fully made a connection to his story in a completely different way. We're working currently on 3 new virtual reality films with a new company. And one of the survivors, Rodi Glass, who is a survivor from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, she and her family were able to survive Westerbork. And she took the headset off. And as you said, she said, this does what I needed it to do. This tells my story in a way that I could never tell it. And does it justice. This is, honoring my legacy in a really important way. So the impact of the survivors, because you feel this like obligation and responsibility, has been really profound. So we're happy with their feedback and joy in the films that we've done.
It seems that the museum is using advanced technology in 2 different ways. The first is the VR movies that go in depth into the story of a survivor, Fritzi, George, and the new one. And the second is through interactive holograms. Can you explain to us the difference in these approaches and what the museum hopes visitors will take away from the hologram experience?
Yeah, so I think with a hologram experience, it provides, I think, a really nice layered or spiraled learning experience for our visitors. So as I mentioned earlier, the holographic technology or dimension testimony, which the museum developed in association with USC Shoah Foundation, uses voice recognition technology for visitors to the museum to be able to engage in a conversation, to be able to ask survivors questions. So similar to, you and I having Siri and asking a question and they respond back. This is that similar idea. So the idea that, our 7 of our survivors we sent to LA to be filmed for 5 days, 8-hour days. When you talk about primary, secondary, tertiary questions, ultimately asked somewhere between 25 to 30,000 questions. Everything, again, from pre-war life to life during the Holocaust to after to, tell me your favorite food, tell me your favorite color. And for many of our visitors, this is the first time that they've, quote unquote, met a survivor, have interacted with a survivor. And it allows you in a way to be able to make, again, that intimate emotional connection to the survivor, because you can ask them questions that you're interested in learning more about, following up on. I still continue to be amazed, 5 years into having this technology at the museum, the depth of questions that they're able to answer, that someone will ask a question and I'm like, they're not going to have an answer to that. And they have an answer to that. It's just amazing to me. For our visitors, particularly our young visitors, there's a level of comfort in this holographic technology than there is over a real survivor sitting in front of them, because they know with this technology, they're not going to offend the survivor with their question. They're not going to hurt the survivor's feelings with their question. So in many ways, the young people are kind of being raw and open with it. So Fritzi is one of our holograms, for instance. So you can learn a little bit about her story, ask her questions, and then to be able to go into our VR gallery and then be walking the grounds with her of the sites that she was just telling you about, or vice versa, right? To be able to do the VR film of Fritzi and then go in, and you're going to have a lot of questions for her that you want to ask her hologram. So it's a nice layered experience for our visitors here.
How long does it take typically take for the museum from the start of the project until the survivor's hologram is ready to display? And how many survivors has the museum interviewed for use in this exhibit?
So since we were involved early on in the project, it took over a year and a half from production to post-production till that hologram was ready. I believe now it's much shorter. The museum filmed 7 of our own survivors involved in the project. We really wanted to make sure that we had survivors that represented both the experiential breadth of the Holocaust, but the geographic breadth of the Holocaust, including having a survivor from the former Soviet-occupied territories. 90% of our survivor population represents survivors from the former Soviet Union, so that was important to us. We actually now in total have 13 survivors that are part of the system, and the USC Shoah Foundation, I believe last count, we're up to nearly 50 survivors and liberators that they have filmed through this remarkable technology. And other museums like Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, Holocaust Museum LA, have all started integrating this technology into the great educational work we're all doing.
Now, the Illinois Holocaust Museum is one of the most renowned Holocaust museums in the country, if not in the world. The museum features not only these immersive VR exhibits that we've talked about, but also traditional educational exhibits and educational programs. As we approach nearly 80 years after the end of the Holocaust, how are museums like yours going to have to adjust to the new reality where the number of survivors is dwindling? The biological clock determines that. Anti-Semitism is rising. And knowledge about the Holocaust among the youngest generation of Americans is falling compared to earlier generations. You probably saw a few years ago, there was a claims conference study, which frankly was shocking in terms of, I think, one question related to who was responsible for the Holocaust. And I think 10% of the respondents to that question said, well, they thought maybe the Jews were responsible themselves for their own fate. So how do the two exhibitions that we've spoken about address that new reality of 80 years on?
Yeah, so I think we're definitely at a crossroads where I think that both the holographic technology and VR technology are, as you mentioned from the beginning, in a really innovative and I think groundbreaking way, working to address this collapsing window that we're facing with the survivor population diminishing. It will never replace that special gift that you and I have had the honor and pleasure, I'm sure, to know hundreds of survivors. But being able to know that now, generations from now, even as our own survivor population and Speakers Bureau grows less and less, that young people or any visitor of any age that visits will now, through that holographic technology or VR technology, be able to know that they heard from a witness who was there. As Elie Wiesel says, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. And that is what we're hoping comes from this virtual reality technology and this holographic technology. But that's not the only thing that we need to be doing. And so as an institution, we're continuing to think about how through how we're even presenting and engaging young people in our field trips, that they're really becoming more about conversations and discussions about, what are the lessons that we can take from this history to apply today, and what is going on in your neighborhood, your community, and your world, so that we're making a connection. What is the training that we're doing for teachers? Dan, we're seeing all of these states now, 20 plus states that have Holocaust mandates. And those are great, but it needs to come with training, and training the teachers how to teach it appropriately and soundly. And that doesn't happen all the time. So making sure that we're training, we're starting to see turnovers in teachers. So training the teachers of how to teach it in a way that's going to have an impact on young people. Again, I think through this idea of story and the power of story and testimony. And I would also just say, I think one of the things that our museum does really well is using our special exhibitions to either do a deep dive into a topic connected to the Holocaust, or again, broader issues of civil and human rights, and to be able to make those connections to the day. Or ongoing genocide. So we can have a conversation with our visitor if we have an exhibition, let's say on Syria, and say, okay, this is happening today. You just went through an exhibit where this is, a genocide that happened 80 years ago. This is happening today. What are you going to do? What are the lessons we can take away from that? And not being afraid as a Holocaust museum to kind of get in the mix and have those difficult conversations about the need to really stand up and speak out against anti-Semitism, and the hatred that we're seeing in our communities, and really be a gathering place, a community gathering place to have those conversations, and not be afraid to do that. I think that that's critical going now past 80 years.
Yeah, I think it's so important in terms of meeting the needs as the survivor population does dwindle. I entered this field 5 decades ago. And I remember giving speeches on Holocaust Memorial Days and other times where I'd say there's going to come a time when there will be no one left with a tattoo on their arm or to talk about their experience having been a victim of this barbarity. And we're approaching that. And clearly what the museum is doing is trying to meet that challenge. But let me ask you, on a wider scale, will it be, because this technology is so needed, will it be cost prohibitive for many museums and institutions to kind of pivot with the new technologies with programming for the future, to serve the future?
I hope not. I mean, definitely it's not an inexpensive endeavor. But, for example, the virtual reality films that we developed and the 3 more currently in development, our goal as an institution is to get them on wireless headsets and start shipping them out to museums, to schools, to libraries, so that folks in, North Dakota to, Alabama can be able to experience this technology and to be able to do that in a cost-effective way. But I think even if you maybe don't have the funding for virtual reality or the holographic technology, is to begin to look at, which we've also done, the 2nd and 3rd generation, to be able to train them to tell the stories of their parent or grandparents, to have, we have teen leaders who are working on adopting survivor stories and learning their stories so that they can continue to share that survivor stories. Again, it's not something that we ever will be able to replace, but at least if we can instill in one person that urgent need to continue to share the story of Fritzy and George, Aaron, Sam, all of our survivors, I think, will continue to spread their message of survival for years to come, hopefully.
Well, one final question, given the interconnectedness of our world, thanks to this technology, the fact that the pandemic has moved much of what we thought could only be done in person to online spaces. I wonder if you could share if the museum has any plans in the works to be able to allow someone anywhere in the world to experience these exhibits without having to physically come to the museum in Chicago.
Yes. So actually, we just partnered with USC Shoah Foundation, where educators actually in their classrooms can interact with Aaron Elster, who's one of our survivors, who became a Dimensions and Testimony, did Dimensions and Testimony of the hologram, where they can interact and talk with Aaron's testimony in their classroom, and bringing that further out into the world. And, as I mentioned, for the virtual reality technology, ultimately getting wireless headset into museums and schools and libraries for people to be able to experience this. And then ultimately, the goal is 2 to 3 years from now is to actually have it be available on the Oculus virtual reality worldwide platform. So anybody in their own home who has a headset can be able to experience this technology.
Well, Kelly Zaney, thank you for your time today. We salute the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center for having such a forward-thinking approach to Holocaust education, and we hope that others will adopt it in order to continue to document the worst genocide in modern history and make Holocaust remembrance more accessible for those of all ages, especially for young people.
Hear, hear, Dan. Thank you for having me.
This concludes our 2023 program for International Holocaust Remembrance Day. B'nai B'rith has been hosting significant events on this day annually through our Office of United Nations Affairs since the inception of the International Day at the United Nations in 2006. We look forward to continuing to commemorate this important day both at the UN and through virtual content in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.